The smarter you are, the easier it is to trap yourself. That sentence sounds backwards. Intelligence is supposed to be the thing that gets you out of problems, not the thing that builds the cage. But a growing body of research suggests something deeply counterintuitive about the human mind. The same cognitive machinery that lets you solve complex problems, that lets you plan 5 steps ahead, that lets you turn a single piece of information into an entire web of implications, is the same machinery that can lock you inside a loop with no exit. And the people most susceptible to this loop are not the people with less capacity to think. They are the people with more. Let's start with what the loop actually is. Psychologists call it rumination. Not simple worry, not ordinary reflection, but a specific pattern of repetitive, passive, self-focused thinking about a problem, a mistake, or a threat, without any accompanying action or resolution. You replay a conversation from 3 days ago, searching for the exact moment it went wrong. You analyze a decision from 6 different angles that all arrive at the same unproductive place. You lie awake reconstructing an email you already sent, imagining 17 alternate versions you could have written instead. The content changes. The pattern doesn't. In 2008, psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema, one of the most influential researchers in this field, published a landmark synthesis of decades of work on rumination in the journal Perspectives on Psychological Science. Her findings were unambiguous. Rumination does not solve problems. It does not lead to insight more often than distraction does. It does not, on average, produce better decisions. What it reliably does is worsen mood, impair concentration, disrupt sleep, and, in a significant number of cases, function as a direct pathway into clinical depression and anxiety. The mental habit that feels like productive problem-solving is, by almost every measurable outcome, closer to a malfunction. But here is where it gets strange, because if rumination is so clearly unproductive, why does the human brain keep doing it? And why does it seem to happen more, not less, in people with higher cognitive ability? The answer starts with a concept neuroscientists call the default mode network. In 2001, neurologist Markus Reichle at Washington University in St. Louis identified a set of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, that become active specifically when you are not focused on an external task. When you are daydreaming, when you are doing nothing in particular, when your mind is, in ordinary language, wandering. This network is not a bug. It appears to be essential for autobiographical memory, for imagining the future, for constructing your sense of self over time. It is, in a real sense, the part of your brain that makes you a continuous person, rather than a series of disconnected moments. The problem is that this same network, when it becomes overactive or fails to properly disengage, is now understood to be centrally involved in rumination. A 2011 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by researcher Matthew Killingsworth at Harvard, tracked over 2,000 participants using a phone-based sampling method, pinging them at random moments throughout the day to ask what they were doing and what they were thinking about. The finding, now one of the most cited in modern psychology, was that people's minds wandered nearly 47% of the time, regardless of what activity they were engaged in. And critically, mind wandering made people measurably less happy than staying focused on the present task, even when the task itself was unpleasant. The title of the paper said it plainly: a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So the very system responsible for your rich inner life, your ability to reflect, to plan, to imagine, is the same system that, left unchecked, drags your mood downward. And here is the part that connects directly to intelligence. Higher working memory capacity, one of the core components of what we colloquially call intelligence, is strongly associated with a greater ability to sustain complex thought over time. This is generally an asset. It is why highly intelligent people can hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously, can model hypothetical scenarios with more branching detail, can construct more elaborate mental simulations of cause and effect. But that same capacity, when directed inward at a threat, a failure, or an anxiety, becomes a liability instead of an asset. The person with greater capacity to sustain complex thought can sustain a ruminative loop with far more elaborate detail and far more persistence than someone with lower working memory capacity. The engine that builds brilliant arguments and the engine that builds inescapable mental traps are, mechanistically, the same engine. In 2013, a study published in the journal Emotion by researcher Alexandre Penet and colleagues found something that should unsettle anyone who takes pride in being a deep thinker. Higher trait rumination correlated with higher scores on measures of verbal intelligence, not lower. Higher. The people who scored better on tests of verbal reasoning were, on average, more prone to getting stuck in repetitive, self-focused analytical loops. The very facility with language and abstract reasoning that makes someone good at articulating complex ideas is the same facility that lets them construct increasingly detailed, increasingly convincing internal arguments for why a problem cannot be resolved, why a mistake cannot be undone, why a fear is justified. This is sometimes called the analysis paralysis trap, though that term undersells what is actually happening neurologically. It is not simply overthinking in a casual sense. It is a specific failure of what researchers call cognitive disengagement. The brain's ability to recognize that further processing of a given piece of information has stopped being useful, and to redirect attention elsewhere. In most people, this disengagement happens automatically, outside conscious awareness. In people with a strong tendency toward rumination, this switching mechanism appears to be less efficient. The mind keeps returning to the same unresolved loop, because the system that should be saying, enough, move on, is not firing the way it does in someone less prone to this pattern. Neuroimaging research adds another layer to this. A 2015 study, published in Neuroimage, led by researcher Rowie Adman and colleagues, found that individuals with higher trait rumination showed reduced functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for top-down control and redirection of attention, and the regions of the default mode network, responsible for self-referential thought. In simpler terms, the part of the brain that should be able to say, "Stop thinking about this now," has a weaker connection to the part of the brain doing the thinking. The car has an engine capable of extraordinary output. The brakes are simply less responsive. And this creates a genuinely uncomfortable paradox. Intelligence, broadly defined, correlates with the ability to notice more, to detect more inconsistencies, more potential threats, more subtle implications in a given situation. This is generally adaptive. It is why highly intelligent people are often better at anticipating problems before they occur. But the same heightened sensitivity to detail and implication means there is simply more raw material available for the ruminative loop to work with. A person who notices fewer things has fewer things to ruminate about. A person whose mind naturally generates dozens of alternate interpretations of a single ambiguous social interaction has dozens of potential entry points into a spiral every single day. There is a specific cognitive distortion that compounds this further, something researchers call the illusion of productive thought. Because rumination often feels like problem solving, because it involves the same neural machinery as genuine analytical reasoning, because it is effortful and mentally demanding, the person engaged in it frequently experiences it as useful work. The brain does not clearly distinguish from the inside between the kind of focused analysis that leads to a decision and the kind of repetitive looping that leads nowhere. Both feel like thinking hard about something important. Only one of them actually resolves anything. In 2020, a large meta-analysis published in Clinical Psychology Review, synthesizing data across dozens of studies and tens of thousands of participants, confirmed what smaller studies had suggested for years. Rumination is one of the strongest known predictors of the onset, severity, and duration of depressive episodes. More predictive in many models than the original stressor that triggered the rumination in the first place. This means the loop itself, independent of whatever problem started it, becomes the primary mechanism of harm. The mind, in trying to resolve a difficulty by thinking about it more, generates a second and often more damaging difficulty out of the thinking process itself. So what does this mean for the specific kind of mind that is drawn to exactly this kind of information? The kind of mind reading a video essay about the neuroscience of overthinking, analyzing it, connecting it to personal experience, perhaps already generating the beginning of a new loop about its own tendency to loop. It means the trap is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of weakness or a failure of discipline. It is a structural consequence of a brain built for exactly the kind of deep, recursive, self-referential thought that makes complex problem-solving possible in the first place. The same architecture that lets you build an intricate mental model of a physics problem, a business strategy, a piece of writing, is the architecture that, when there is no external problem to solve, turns inward and starts building intricate mental models of your own inadequacy instead. The prison and the workshop are made of the same materials, built by the same hands, running on the same power source. And the door was never locked from the outside.